Hi, we are continuing on Masechet Berachot, and we are doing Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Bet 37b today. The learning of Amud Yomi for Chodesh Heshvan has been sponsored by Shahab and Shenaz Rabbi for the health, prosperity, and Hatzlacha of their family and their growth in Torah. It's also been sponsored by Hami family, Leilui Nishmat Yosef ben Alegra Simcha bat Rachel, and Aliza Talisar bat Hanoch Feivel, that the Neshamot should have an Aliyah. Amen. Amen. The entire learning of KBT this week has been sponsored by Dr. Omid and Kelly Shea for the Hatzlacha and prosperity of their family in every aspect. Amen. Amen. Okay, we are 19 lines down, and we're going to discuss, continuing the halachot of mixtures that have mezonot in them, or bread that has been cooked after being pieced off. So it says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Hai Chabitza, the itbah perurin kazayit. When you have a food called chabitza, what is chabitza? So they would have bread, and they would take pieces off and put it in the pot and cook it with other ingredients. You have pieces of kazayit, of bread, cooked in pot, basically, very much similar to what we had yesterday. And says the Gemara, but chila mevarech alav hamotzi, lechem min haaretz, ulbasof marech alav shalosh brachot. You make hamotzi and you make birkat hamazon on chabitza. So says the Gemara, teletz be perurin kazait. If you don't have perurin kazait, if the pieces of bread are not large enough, then you make on it borei minei mezonot, and at the end you say bracha achad mein shalosh. In other words, even though that you started off with bread, because you're cooking the bread, the bracha of the bread could change, given that it's not kazait. That's what it seems to be from the Gemara now, from this braita that we just studied, right? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yosef. This is a teaching that Rav Yosef taught, and now the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef, Mina aminallah. How do I know this difference that I just mentioned? That if you have bread and you use the bread as ingredients of other food, then it depends if the pieces of bread that you have at the end result are kazait or not. If it's kazait, you make hamotzi and birkat hamazon. In other words, nothing of the bread has changed. If the pieces are smaller than kazait, then you have to go down one level and you'll have mezonot and alamihya. How do I know this? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yosef said, I know this from the halachot of menachot. You learned this Gemara in Masechet Menachot, Daf Ayin Hey. The Gemara says, a braita. Haya omedu makriv menachot Yerushalayim. According to Rashi over here, it means a Yisrael that goes to Yerushalayim, he wants to bring a korban. So Israel doesn't bring the korban, he gives it to the Kohen to bring a korban. Omer baruch shehyanu v'chiyemanu v'ikiyanu lazman hazeh. If he hasn't brought the korban recently, which the Rishonim explains within 30 days, past 30 days you haven't brought the korban, that's already considered a new thing that you say bracha on it, right? You go to Bet HaKvarot, and there's a bracha to be said in Bet HaKvarot if you haven't been there 30 days, right? If you haven't been into a Bet HaChaim 30 days. You go to the sea, right? You go to the ocean, you make a bracha if you haven't been by the ocean for 30 days. It'll never happen for you, right? Yeah. So the bracha is on the newness. You make shehayanu. Rashi in Masechet Menachot that we mentioned, he says it could be talking about a Kohen himself that for the very first time in his life he's bringing a korban in Beit HaMikdash. He makes shehayanu, or he's bringing a mincha hadasha. Rashi says, okay. Be that as it may, if there is a certain sense of newness to it, you make shehayanu v'chiyemanu v'ikiyanu lazman hazeh. Then netalan leochlan, you want to eat the korban mincha. Now, korban mincha, there are different types of menachot, right? And here the Braita says, Mevarech hamotzi lechem min haaretz. You make the bracha of hamotzi. So here we have a Braita, before we analyze the Braita, that says if you take from Korban Mincha to eat, what bracha do you make? Hamotzi. Now, the Menachot, many of them were cooked, many of them were deep fried with oil, right? And yet, you're making hamotzi. Now, how big is this pieces of Menachot? You had to do kmitzah. You would take the bread that you would make, Korban Mincha, you would also break it to small pieces before you did kmitzah, right? So how big are these pieces of bread? That the Braita just now told us that you make hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Says the Gemara v'tanyala, we learned on this, v'kulan potetan kazayit. All of it, before the kmitzah, you piece them to pieces that are kazayit. So it seems that we have a clear Gemara Braita that if you have pieces of kazayit, even though that they've been cooked, they've been fried with oil, you still make what? Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Rabbi Yosef says that's exactly what I said. If you take bread, you have pieces of kazayit of it, and then you cook it, you make a new dish with it. If it's kazayit, it retains the bracha of hamotzi and birkat hamazon. Smaller than that, no. And that's why it says kulan potetan kazayit. All of them are kazayit. So according to this, Rabbi Yosef says, you see, I have a befershe Braita in Masechet Menachot that talks about halachot of brachot. Abaye says, wait a second. There is another Tana also. It's not the only one. This that you just said. Says the Gemara, Amar leha Abaye, ela ma'ata letana de Rabbi Yishmael, Tana de Rabbi Yishmael, the Bet Midrash of Rabbi Yishmael, they said, no, you don't cut them to pieces that are kazayit, but rather you basically cut them to pieces that are so small that you take it back to its state of being flour. You make it small, right? You take the bread apart to the degree that it becomes like flour. Abaye says, well, you want to suggest that according to them, this Braita that earlier on we learned the Gemara that on Menachot you make hamotzi doesn't apply. The Tana de Biri Ishmael is arguing with that. The simple understanding is that when we learned the Braita that on Menachot you make hamotzi is going according to all the Tanaim. Whether the Tana that says the pieces are kazayit, and also according to the Tana de Rabbi Ishmael, that says the pieces are small, tiny bits and pieces of bread. And you see, according to that, also on small pieces you make hamotzi. This is Abaye's kasha to Rabbi Yosef. A very good question. Very good question. Says the Gemara, V'chitema hachinami. Abaye says, you could technically, theoretically, you could say that this is talking about a machloket, that the really Tana de Rabbi Yishmael argues. And he says, you don't make hamotzi on it because you make them so small. Says Abaye, you can't say that. I will prove to you that the bracha is hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Ve'hatanya, we learned in the Braita, lakat mikulan kazayit. If you gathered from all these menachot a kazayit together, ve'achalan, and you ate them, im hametzu anosh karet. If they're hametz and you're on Pesach, you get karet. And if they're matzah, ve'im matzahu, adam yotze bo yedeh chovato bePesach. Then you eat kazayit of them, you have done your obligation of eating kazayit of matzah on Pesach. Right? Now, matzah, in order to do your obligation of matzah, you have to have lechem, because it's called lechem oni, right? It has to be lechem. and lechem is hamotzi. So you see over here that what bracha are you making? Hamotzi. If you tell me that you could eat this for your chiyuv of matzah and Pesach, it must be quote unquote a lechem, a halachic lechem, and you make hamotzi on it. On lechem you make hamotzi. That's exactly the point of Abaye. Abaye says, you see, you're gathering pieces of melachot, and the subtotal of them is a kazayit, and yet you're making what bracha? Hamotzi on what? On little crumbs. So Abaye says, don't give me that argument that on the small pieces you're making mezonot, and Tana de Rabbi Ishmael is arguing with the original braita that we said it has to be bracha of hamotzi. No, the bracha is hamotzi, and even it covers the shita of Tana de Rabbi Ishmael that we're talking about tiny little pieces. It's like solid already. It's like flour. That's a real case, right? Right? You're with me?
But he's saying to gather the pieces into one kazayit. If you don't gather them into kazayit.
No, but you gathered them. It's in your hand. Now, the Gemara is going to make that argument that you just suggested, right? Gemara says, no, you know what we're talking about? You're making it to solid, you're making it to flour, and then you reconstruct them and you bake them again. That's what we're talking about. That's what he's going to try to, the Gemara is going to try to say to get out of this bomb kasha of Abaye. Abaye asked a very good question, right? Says, I prove to you that even little pieces are hamotzi. Because it says you're yotzeh, you're yedechova on Pesach with matzah. And on matzah, we all know you always make hamotzi. Because it has to be lechem, the Torah says, lechem oni, right? So you're making hamotzi on it, and it said that you gather a kazayit from all of them. So it means each one of them is small perurin, it's small pieces.
Hold on. You're only going to have one piece of still down. Meaning the question is, are you only having one?
You're saying, of course, because you took a little piece from this korban minha, a little piece from this korban minha, and the pieces, small pieces.
No, but if they sum to a kazayit, then you had a kazayit.
But if it was less.
So what? They're not one piece. The bracha you make is on every single one of them. If you have a jar of cookie, you make hamotzi on it. Every one of them is mezonot, is mezonot. If every one of them would be mezonot, the fact that you have 15 of them does not make a difference. You still make mezonot. Unless you want to be kovea suda, which is a sugya we're going to get to. But for now, these pieces...
I take a piece of bread and I cut it into 25 pieces, put it all in front of me.
We haven't gotten to that yet. No, we haven't gotten to that yet. We haven't gotten to that. By the way, you have to understand, in this sugya, whatever we're going to cover is just scratching the surface. It's like, there's machloket Rashi and Tosafot, whether or not we're talking about the case that Dr. Shea just mentioned, of taking bread to pieces, small pieces, and not touching it. Or are we talking about that's the Tosafot? Or, like Rashi, that says, no, you're taking the bread to small pieces and then you're cooking it or frying it, right? So according to Tosafot, in Tosafot's worlds, you're correct. In the world of Tosafot, there's what to be spoken about your case, because that's the whole discussion in the Gemara. In the world of Rashi, you have altered it with cooking them after you take them apart. So we're discussing, does the bread lose its identity by making it to small pieces and now adding ingredients and making it hadig, right? Like your case, or making it soup into other things, cooking it into, croutons. No, croutons is a little different. Look, again, we'll because you mentioned it, I want you to know, I want this to be a reality in our lives, right? And to the degree that's possible, that the time would allow us, I'll go into tangents of halakha. But croutons, it actually links together with the Gemara that we just had prior to this, with hearts of palm. You remember we had the Gemara with hearts of palm that said, If you plant them in order to have parts of palm, is a different bracha than if you make hearts of palm out of just the palm tree that's there, right? Because it's not the kavanah of the planting. The Magen Avraham says the same thing applies to something like a crouton. If you are a crouton factory or a bread, they have the pita chips, right? If you're a pita chips factory, so you bake pitas in order to make pita chips, which is a cracker. You make challah in order to make croutons, which is a salad thing. It's not bread. It's not meant to be eaten like bread. Says the Magen Avraham, then you make boramine mezonot. If you make croutons at home because your wife is going to kill you if you trash the challah, so you have to cut it up to pieces and make croutons out of it, or make pita chips out of the pita, right? Then you make hamotzi on it because it is still keeping its status as a, and we're going to get to that. That happens to be halacha, actually, right? The croutons, yeah, French toast is a little different. French toast, because French toast is a whole different world, right? This we're talking about cases that you have pieces smaller than kazait, right? Even smaller than kazait. Right, don't get
Rabbi started.
You ask them.
Oh, you asked them? Oh,
yes. So, yeah, that's for sure. That's like, you can get around the question. Okay, fine. So listen. So Abaya has a fantastic question, right? Abaya has a fantastic question. It says, I brought to you a proof that even in small pieces, you make hamotzi in menachot. Because you see, you could be yotzei yorid chova on Pesach with matzah, which means is lehem, which means you say hamotzi, and the case is small pieces, right? The Gemara says, you know what we're talking about over here? When you put them together, you reconstructed those pieces and you baked it again to matzah. That's what we're talking about. You're wondering why it's hamotzi, because one big, nice piece that you got from small pieces of menachot, but really on the small pieces of menachot, shalom, you make mezonot on those because they're not kazai. That's the Gemara wants to get out of the question of Abaye, right? The Gemara says, pay this. If that's the case, that you reconstructed the small pieces to one big piece, ema sefa. Look at the sefa, the end of the Braita. The only time that you're yotze, your yedechova av matzah, is if you ate them, the pieces, in the time slot, it's the time period of achilat pras, right? In the time that takes to eat a half a loaf, which is a machloket rishonim, Rashi and Rambam, how big of a loaf? Is it 3 kazayits? Is it 3 kabetzas? Is it 4 kabetzas? And what the time is somewhere between 3.5 to 9 minutes, right? So k'da achilat pras. So says the Gemara, if it's a case that you reconstructed the small crumbs and pieces to one large piece, why do you say achalan? It's not achalan, it's not ate them, it's ate it, right? Achalon mibaile. The language of the Braita is almost muchach. It's pretty clear that you have not reconstructed them to one big piece. Says the Gemara, therefore the Gemara says, no. He retracts the suggestion of reconstructing it to one piece. Says, no, you know what it is? It is really small pieces of menachot, but you know what? It's coming from a loaf of bread. In other words, If you have a big loaf of bread over here in front of you, you cut half of it. Half of the loaf is sitting here still. And you take the other half and you make perurim, you make small, less than kazayit pieces of it. They still are connected to their mother, so to speak, right? They're still connected to where they came from, and what they came from still sitting there as a big fat loaf of bread, half a loaf of bread. So therefore, they don't lose their bracha of hamotzi so long as the other half is kayam. If you take all of them and you make all of them to little pieces, so you destroyed the loaf of bread. No more bread, it's crumbs. But if you took a piece out of a challah, challah is sitting there still. And so long as the mother challah, so to speak, is there, the little pieces that you took from it is still going to maintain the bracha of the loaf, which would be hamotzi. That's a new suggestion. We're talking about the case that these perurin, these small pieces of menachot, smaller than kazayit, are coming from a larger piece of halal. Says the Gemara. My Havale says, I'm very confused. At the end, what's the halacha? Please tell me what the halacha. The bottom line, what's the bracha of chavitza? I have a simple question. We started with this chavitza, this dish that you make with perurim, with pieces of kazai. So what's the halacha? Amar Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet says, "Hi chavitza, the chavitza af al gav delet beperurin kazait, even though that it doesn't have pieces of kazait, is smaller than kazait, the pieces that you have. Mevarech alav hamotzi lechem min haaretz. You make on it hamotzi lechem min haaretz. But wait. Amar Rava says, vehu deika ale torita denam. That's only if you maintained surat halechem. That you take a look at every piece, you see bread. They have, you see, it's barbari, right? You see, you see the surah, the image of a bread on it has not been destroyed. If it becomes like dissolved and the cooking process, the frying process completely alters the looks of it, in which you don't see bread anymore in it when you look at it, you just see a piece of something, then it loses its bracha. So long as it looks like bread, it still maintains its bracha. Now, this becomes a big machloket, Tosafot and other Rishonim, whether or not this goes together with what we said in the beginning, that kazayit also is only, what we said kazayit, Yushalmi, Bavli, the kazayit that we said in the beginning also is only to keep the tzura. Meaning, the main thing is, if you have pieces of bread in a dish that you processed, if you take a look at them and say, this is bread. I could see the barbari in there. I could see the, whatever it is, the French bread is there. I could see it. That's the ikar. But usually, if you have something less than kazayit, you won't have tzurat alechem. You won't have torita denama.
You actually do see the bread. Smaller than the kazayit.
So that again, that would be an example of this. That usually, when you have less than kazayit, you don't have tzurat alechem. Or is it a real machloket? Or is the real machloket that some hold, because this seems to be the maskana of the Gemara. The Gemara says, what's chavitza at the end of the day? And it says, even if it's less than kazayit, still, you will say, hamotzi on it, because it's given that he has surat alechem, right? Given that he has torit hadenama.
That trumps the size. Meaning if you have something that's larger than a kavitza but doesn't look like bread, which one trumps what? If you have something bread, it's bigger than a kazayit, but you can't tell it's bread.
Correct. According to this, if you don't have surat alechem, it's completely destroyed. Nobody could know that this is bread because it has been penetrated with water and soup and it's all falling apart and it doesn't look like anything like bread. Oh, be questionable as well. You see, these two are where we go in between them, and What's the halacha exactly? This, by the way, you know what becomes lemaaseh when you have an erev Pesach shechal lihiyot b'Shabbat, right? If erev Pesach is Shabbat, first day of Pesach is Sunday, right? So erev Pesach is Shabbat. You're hayav to eat a seudah. What do you do with seudah? Seudah means with bread. How do you eat bread on erev Pesach?
Less than a kibbutz,
Right? So you could have actually an early seudah of Shabbat, right? Where the Zman Isur, the time of Isur of Chametz is in half an hour, and your wife is having a heart attack because you're having the challah and the crumbs are falling, and she's been killing herself for past 3 months to make the house chametz free. Like you go those houses that you go on Purim, it says don't bring in chametz, we're chametz free. Like you see, like already once before they're already completely free of chametz, and now 2 minutes before Zman Isur you're eating challah, right? Or some people don't want to do that. They want to take any chances. So what do? You can't have mezonot. You have to have seudah, right? And you can't eat matzah on erev Pesach. It's an isur of eating matzah, right? Isur of. Oh, how do you do with seudah shlishit? That's another question. Seudah shlishit, you want to have bread, right? You can't have bread. Seudah shlishit, you can't have matzah because erev Pesach is asur to eat matzah. Right? So what do? You have large pieces of matzah, or kazait, and you cook them in soup, you dip them in boiling soup, or deep fry them in oil, and take them out, and dry them. So that is no longer a matzah that you could be yotzeh, your yedechovah on Pesach, because it became matzah ashira, basically, right? But still, it has the halachot of pat, because it's a kazait, and it has turita lena'ama, it has surat alehem, right? So you see, this basic things that we learn, little tiny details of Gemara, they're actually lemaaseh, very much lemaaseh. So says the Gemara. Now, what do we say on a bread called trokinin? Trokinin chayavin b'hala. If you make troknin, you have to separate hala from it. V'chiata Ravin, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Ravin came back to Bavel from Eretz Yisrael, he said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, troknin, the same food, troknin, peturin min hala. If you make troknin, you're patur from separating hala from. So it says in Gemara, you have a machloket amuraim over here, whether or not you have to separate hala from troknin. What is troknin? Right? Says Gemara, my troknin, what is it? This food. Amar Abaye. Abaye said it's kuba de ara. Now we're gonna get back to this kuba de ara, but generally speaking, it means you don't make isa, you don't make a dough, you just put flour and water and you mix them a little bit, and you put it in a indentation on top of the oven, or some learn, so it's machloket rishonim, that you have an indentation in the ground, that you make fire there, it's hot, and you just pour this mixture in there, and it becomes some sort of edible, object. It becomes something, some food. It's not bread because you don't have a dough to bake it. It's like you mix water with flour and you just pour it in there and it bakes. So is that bread or is that not bread? So it's machloket. Rabbi Yochanan says you don't have to take challah from this. It's not bread. It's not a dough. If you don't have dough, you don't have challah. The other chachamim say no, you do take. So says the Gemara, that's what Abaye says. The Amar Abaye, before we get back to Kuba de Ara, what the halacha is on the Berachot, Abaye also says, terita, a food called terita, tura mina hallah. You don't have to take hallah from it. We're going to see in a moment what terita is. My terita. The Gemara is going to give 3 different explanations as to what terita could be. Ikati Amri, there are those who say terita is gavil meratach, that terita is something that you mix. You mix the kemach and mayim, flour and water, in a vessel. Instead of making a dough, it's a very watery mixture that you could just, mix it with mix it with spoon. You have flour and water, and then you pour it on top of a hot surface on top of the oven. That's what it is. What do we call that? Pancake, crepe, all those things, right? Now, don't take this halachic, because once you get into the Mishnah Berurah and the actual halacha, you'll see it depends on how samich, how thick the mixture is, and so on and so forth. We're not discussing halacha lema'asena, but this is what some say is this item of terita, right? And there are those who say nama de hindika. It's the Indian bread, right? It's the Indian bread. What's the Indian bread? The Indians used to make the bread like kebab. They'll take dough, they will put it into shpudim on top of the fire, and as it's baking on fire, they would smear it with shemen, with oil and with eggs. So that was a thing that they had. Don't try that home. So that's nama de hindika, right? That's the second option of what terita is. And the third one is v'ikadamri lechem ha'asui lekutach. Now, kutach is a very famous dish that's mentioned all over Shas. It was a milchik dish, like with milk inside, and they would wait for the bread to become old, upash, almost like stale, and then they would piece it and mix it with other milchik items, and the mixture was kutach. It was a dip that they had, right? It was a milchik dip. So says, and by the way, the bread that they had for kutach was not a regular bread, right? How would they make the bread for kutach? They would make it not in tanur, not in the oven, but they would make it in the sun, right? It was not a regular. Take a look at the last line of Rashi. Would make this bread, spreading the thin dough in the hama, in the sun, and that's how they made it. And then they would wait for it to become old, and then they would piece it and put it into this dip called kutach, right? So that all of these three options are not normal breads that you would take challah out of it, right? First one is like a mixture, watery mixture, you pour it on top of things. Not a normal dough, and it's not a normal baking. The second one is certainly not a normal baking, right? And the third one also is not a normal baking, a mixture that you put in the hama, in the sun. Okay, so therefore, is patur from taking challah out of it. Says the Gemara, v'hatanya hayav bechallah. You telling me that terita is patur from challah, but we have a braita that says hayav and challah. The Gemara says no. Hatam kedekatani tama. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ma'aseh mochichin aleh. That braita that talks about kutach, we learned on it why it would be hayav bechallah, because it says ma'aseh mochichin aleh. That means what? It depends how you make it. Sometimes you make it in a way that you are showing with your actions that you want bread, right? You want bread, but then if the bread you have leftovers, you make croutons out of it. That's the same halakha that we mentioned. So if you make it asa'an kavin, the top of Lamed Hayt Amud Aleph, if you make it when you want to bake the bread, you set up the dough beautifully, like with soft and smooth surface. Then you show that you want to make challah, right? That the challah, the bread that you're making, is your end product. That's why you want it to be nice. If you wanted to cut off the pieces of the bread and put it in the kutach, would you care about how it looks? Absolutely not. Who cares? Like, I'm going to bake it, and then I'm going to take it to pieces and put it into a dip. Nobody cares. So if you set it up nicely, beautifully from the beginning, you're showing that you want this to be bread. Yeah, if I have some extras, the extras I will make kutach from. But if I make the bread originally, and I just put it there like that, without making it nice and set, that shows that I want kutach. I'm just making this bread in order to make the dip. And that's the difference. If you make it to make challah, then you make these separate challah from it. Even though that you have in the back of your mind that the extras will deal with. But if you make bread in order to make kutach, you say, not making bread. Asaka avin, hayavin. But kelemudin, if you make it like bricks, you don't care about the like pieces of wood, that you don't care about the looks of it. So then it shows that you're making it for kutach, and therefore you don't separate halal from it. Now we go back. This was a tangent. Now we go back to we're out of time, but we have a Gemara that's going back now to this. The first thing that we started from Kuba de Ara. What's going to be the bracha? No, so we